Hello, hello. Welcome to El Grano con Nora, real talk on power and possibility without the fluff. I'm Nora Vargas, and for over 30 years, I've been on the front lines, navigating crisis and breaking down barriers. From being an executive assistant, community organizer, to CEO, to 12 years as an elected official. Yep, 12 years making decisions, carrying responsibility, and navigating it all without a playbook. This podcast is really about real talk, real conversations about leadership, power, responsibility, and possibility. And really what it means to keep believing and redefining what the American dream is, despite it all. I bring a little bit of a different lens to leadership because the reality is the world doesn't look the same for everyone. And it definitely doesn't look the same for Latinas, for women, for first generation professionals, for people who spend their lives navigating different worlds while trying to stay true to themselves. And that's exactly why I wanted to have today's conversation, because I think we spend a lot of our lives looking for better answers, the right answer, the perfect answer, the answer that's going to solve everything. And honestly, the older I get, the more I realize maybe we've been chasing the wrong thing. Maybe the goal isn't to have better answers. Maybe the goal is to ask better questions. This year has been one of the busiest years of my life. And honestly, and people who know me know that I've had pretty busy lives. But honestly, one of the most rewarding years I've had because I've been building my business. I've been recording this podcast that brings me so much joy. I've been speaking around the country. I've been coaching leaders and spending time outdoors preparing for what's next. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I've also been finishing my graduate school. I'm really proud to say I completed all my graduate coursework now, and it feels good. Not because I was chasing another degree, but because learning has always been one of my core values. I've never believed that education ends when you graduate. In fact, I think leadership requires the opposite. The more responsibility we have, the more curious we should become. So one of the books that was assigned in one of my graduate classes was Peter Drucker's The 5 Most Important Questions You Will Ever Ask about your organization. And if you spend any time in leadership, you've probably heard of Peter Drucker. He's often called the father of modern management. His work has influenced generations of leaders. CEOs, nonprofit executives, government leaders, entrepreneurs, people all over the world. So when I saw the assignment, I smiled and I thought, all right, Drucker, I got you. I expected to revisit ideas I already knew. I expected to highlight a few passages, write a paper, and move on to the next assignment. I was like, this is easy because I have a lot to do. But that's not what happened. Because sometimes a book doesn't change. You do. And that's exactly what happened to me. It wasn't reading Drucker through the eyes of a graduate student. I wasn't reading him as the CEO of an organization. I wasn't reading him as the chair of the county board of supervisors, and I wasn't reading him as someone trying to climb another ladder. I was reading him as Nora, a woman who's lived enough life to realize that the question I asked at 25 those are not the same questions I'm asking at 54. And honestly, they shouldn't be. Because if we're growing, our questions should grow too. I found myself putting the book down, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't stop thinking. The questions kept following me. Not organizational questions. It was life questions, leadership questions, questions that don't fit nearly into a strategic plan, questions that don't have one right answer, questions that make you stop, questions that make you reflect, and questions that quietly whisper, are you still asking the questions that serve the life you're trying to build? And that one really hit me. Because if I'm honest, I've spent a lot of life asking questions like, what's next? How do I prepare? How do I get better? How do I make a difference? How do I serve? And those are all good questions. They've served me very well. They've helped me build a career I'm incredibly proud of. They've taken me into rooms I've never imagined I enter, and they've introduced me to extraordinary people. They've opened doors I didn't even know existed. But somewhere along the way, I realized something. Sometimes the questions that got us here aren't the questions we need to be asking for what's next. And that doesn't make the old questions wrong. It just means life keeps inviting us to ask new ones. And I wonder, how many of us are still living by questions we outgrew years ago? Questions someone else handed us. Questions society handed us. Questions our profession handed us. Questions our family handed us. Questions that made sense 20 years ago, but maybe don't anymore. And that realization stayed with me because I don't think leadership begins with answers. I think leadership begins with curiosity, with humility, with being able to willing actually to ask ourselves questions that don't have easy answers, the ability to listen, the questions that stretch us, questions that challenge us, questions that invite us to become more intentional about the life we're building. And that's when I realized that this episode that I wanted to share with you today wasn't about Peter Drucker. It was all about all of us, because maybe the quality of our lives isn't determined by the answers we have. Maybe it's determined by the questions we're willing to ask ourselves. And so as I reflect on all this, I realize something. It's not that I've started asking better questions. I've always been very curious and I've always asked a lot of questions. But questions have guided me almost every important decision I've ever made. The difference is that the questions have evolved. When I was younger, I asked, how do I create opportunities? How do I get an education? How do I make a difference? How do I become a better leader? Those were the right questions for that season in my life. And they opened a lot of doors. They pushed me, they challenged me, they shaped who I became. But life has a way of inviting us into new questions, not because the old ones were wrong, but because we've grown. So today I find myself asking different questions. What really matters now? What kind of life am I building? Where can I have the greatest impact? And what do I need to let go of? Who am I becoming? And those questions aren't better than the ones I used to ask 20 years ago. They're simply the questions this season of my life requires. Maybe that's the lesson. Growth isn't about having a different answer. It's about having the courage to keep asking new questions as life changes. So as I sat there reading, I started thinking about my own life, not my resume, not my accomplishments, my life. And I realized something. It's not that I've started asking better questions. I've always been curious. I've always asked questions. Questions have guided me almost every important decision I've ever made. The difference is the questions have evolved. When I was younger, my questions were about possibility and how do I create opportunities? How do I get an education? How do I make a difference? How do I become a better leader? And those are all the right questions for the season of my life. They're not the better questions that one asked 30 or 20 or 30 years ago. They're simply the questions in this season of my life. But by reminding me of the power of asking better questions, one of the things that I love about Peter Drucker's work is that he wasn't obsessed with answers. He was obsessed with the questions, because good questions force us to think. Good questions force us to pause. Good questions don't allow us to hide behind easy responses. So as I reflect on that, I started thinking to myself 20 years ago. And that's the answer that surprised me. There weren't organizational questions, the life questions, leadership questions, human questions, and I came up with 5. Not because these are the only questions that matter, but because they've become the questions that are shaping my life right now. And I realized something. These aren't better questions than the ones I asked 20 years ago. They're simply the questions the season of my life requires. So my hope is that you don't have to wait 20 years to ask your own questions, because sometimes one better question today can change the direction of your tomorrow. We don't stop asking questions. We simply begin asking different ones. So the first question is, what really matters? Not what feels urgent, not what everyone else is asking from me, but what actually matters. Because if we're not clear on that, everything feels equally important. And then everything, really is important. Nothing truly is. The second question is, who am I serving? That question has stayed with me throughout my entire career, as an organizer, nonprofit leader, as an elected official, as a coach, because leadership isn't about us. It's about the people we're trying to serve. But here's the part I had to learn. Serving others doesn't mean losing yourself. There's a difference. And the third question surprised me. What do I need to let go of? Not what do I need to do more of, but what do I need to release? Old expectations, old definitions of success, old fears, old identities. Sometimes growth isn't about adding. Sometimes it's about letting it go. And so if you listen to this season, you know that that's been a recurring theme in my own life. Starting over, learning to sail, building a business, leaving office. Every one of those experiences required letting go of something before I could embrace something new. So the fourth question became, what impact am I actually making? Not what impact do I hope I'm making, not what impact people assume I'm making, but what impact am I actually making? Because intentions matter, because impact matters too. Sometimes they're the same and sometimes they aren't. The question keeps me honest. And finally, the question that has probably stayed with me the most is, who am I becoming? Not who was I, or not who do people expect me to be, but who am I becoming? Because leadership is not a destination. It's a continual process of becoming, of learning, of growing, of changing, of being willing to evolve. And maybe that's the question underneath all the others. Because if we're becoming more curious, more compassionate, more intentional, more grounded, then perhaps we're already moving in the right direction. And that's when I realized something. Peter Drucker gave me questions, and life gave me that meaning. So, as I think about my no manches moment, I want to talk about something for a minute. Somewhere along the way, we became obsessed with having the right answers. Seriously, think about it. We're expected to have the answer in meetings, the answer in interviews, the answer in relationships, the answer as parents, the answer as leaders, the answer as partners, supervisors, the answers before we even finish the question. Entonces, I say, no manches. What happened to curiosity? What happened to saying, I don't know? Or that's really a good question? Or my favorite, I never thought about it that way, right? Do you know how freeing that is? Because here's what I've noticed. The older I get, the less pressure I feel to prove I'm the smartest person in the room. And the more responsibility I feel to make sure we're asking the right questions. Those are two completely different leadership styles. One is driven by ego and the other is driven by curiosity. And curiosity is so very powerful. Curiosity builds trust, curiosity creates learning, curiosity opens doors, and curiosity changes conversations. Así que no manches, imagine how different our meetings would be if people spend less time trying to sound smarter than the other and more time trying to understand. Imagine how different our families would be if we asked more questions instead of making more assumptions. Imagine how different our communities would be if we got curious before we got defensive. Maybe leadership isn't about being the first person to speak. Maybe leadership is asking the question nobody else taught to ask. Now that's a different kind of leadership. And so, in my reflections and your takeaway in El Granito de Oro, here's what I want to leave you with today. I don't expect you to remember who Peter Drucker was. And I don't even expect you to remember all 5 questions that we've talked about today. But I do hope you remember this. The quality of your life is deeply connected to the quality of the questions you're willing to ask yourself. Questions have a way of changing us, not because they immediately give us answers, but because they change what we pay attention to. They change how we think. They change how we make decisions. And sometimes they quietly change the direction of our lives. So this week, instead of trying to have all the answers, try asking yourself a better question. Maybe it's, or what really matters, maybe it's who am I serving? Maybe it's what do I need to let go of? Maybe it's what impact am I actually making? Or maybe the question you need to completely ask is different. The point is, it isn't my questions that you should be asking. The point is that you're asking your own questions. Because here's what I know after more than 35 years in leadership. The best leaders I've ever met weren't the people who had all the answers. They were the people who never stopped learning, the people who never stopped listening, the people who never stopped asking thoughtful questions, who reminded us the curiosity was key, even after they had achieved so much success. And maybe that's what growth really looks like. Not arriving, always remaining curious, because curiosity keeps us humble. Curiosity keeps us learning. Curiosity keeps us connected. And curiosity reminds us that we're never really finished. So here's my invitation to you today. The next time you find yourself looking for the perfect answer, just pause, take a minute, and ask yourself, am I asking the best question? Because maybe, just maybe, one better question can change the direction of your life. And so with that, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for continuing this journey with me. If today's conversation resonated with you, I hope you'll share with someone who's navigating an important decision, someone who's searching for answers, or maybe someone who simply needs a better question. Leave a comment, send me a message. I'd love to know what question has changed your life, or what question are you asking yourself right now? This is El Grano, real talk on power and possibility without the fluff. And this is the American dream despite it all. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, keep asking better questions, because sometimes the question changes everything. Nos vemos pronto.